Hey, church family, we're here today to do another video to recap in the book of Genesis. And today we're recapping chapters 10 and 11 to prepare for the sermon this Sunday. But as a kind of a precursor to chapters 10 and 11, we are going to catch the back end of chapter 9 because we didn't cover that this last Sunday. So we're going to kind of mention it. I'm going to mention it in the message, but we're kind of not going to spend a lot of time on that. So we're going to do that a little bit now. So the back end of Genesis chapter 9 is you got the story of Noah and his three sons and a cursing of Ham and through the Canaan. And so it's a little different. So we're going to look at the story of Ham and Canaan and the sin and the curse. And so Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 through 29 is kind of where the story happens. To kind of summarize that or to kind of read some of those verses, we're going to look at verse 20. It says, "Now Noah, as a man of the soil, began to planting a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a cloak and placed it over both their shoulders, and walking backward, they covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness." Now, that seems like an innocent enough story that came in, saw his father was been drunk, naked. Side note, you have Noah here, who was the man that was righteous in his day, the only righteous man in his day. And during that day, it says that they were drinking and dancing and giving, they were happy, joyful, doing all these things, partying as if nothing was going to happen. And then the judgment of God came through the flood, and Noah is saved through the ark, and his family is saved. And then he comes off the ark, he makes these sacrifices and worships the Lord. And Noah has just experienced this great act of God saving him from his wrath and all this redemption and all these things. And then Noah gets drunk. Go figure, right? And so he gets drunk. Verse 24, when Noah awoke from his drinking and learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Canaan is cursed. He will be the lowest of slaves to his brothers." Now, there's a lot going on here, and historically, you have some stories that come out of this. And then you have some modern day interpretations of this. So what was the sin? Why did it cause this great cursing? And so what was the sin? Now, historically speaking, Jewish tradition and older church history traditions say that this was a sin that either Ham or Canaan committed against Noah. And it was a homosexual act that happened here. There's also the other Jewish tradition story that comes out of this that Ham castrated his father, and so he couldn't have more sons and all those things. So those are the two common ones. Modern day, you'll hear modern theologians kind of talk, well, this is debated. We don't really know. This wasn't the right terminology. It's just that, hey, back then being naked was a bigger deal. And so if you just saw someone naked, this is why the cursing happened. But the reality of it is what we see here is we see that something was done. And it says in verse, like it says in 9:24, when Noah awoke from his drinking and learned what his youngest son had done to him. And earlier it mentioned that Noah was the one that stripped himself. And so Noah stripped himself, he was drunk and all this stuff, and then his youngest son did something to him. And the question here is like, first question is, who's the youngest son? Now, it was not uncommon for a grandfather to refer to his grandchildren. At this day, Jewish tradition, the Hebrews and all this kind of stuff, to refer to their grandsons as their sons. And Canaan would have been his youngest, because it would have been his youngest grandson of his youngest son. And so Canaan would have been the youngest. And so that wasn't uncommon. So this very well could have been Canaan. And that's why Canaan was cursed, because it says, look what my youngest son had done to me. And all Ham did was be like to his brothers, like, oh no, look what's happened to Noah. And then his older sons came in and covered him up. And so the act that was committed against Noah, the debate is whether it was Ham or Canaan that did it. Not necessarily debated what was done to him, but later, like I said, modern theologians debate what was actually done to him. Was this really a homosexual act or not? But one of the clues we get that Canaan possibly was the one that done this, because Canaan is the one that is cursed. That falls right in line, the youngest son comment there, because that was a common phrase that grandfathers used of their grandsons. But also we see coming from Canaan, we saw in his genealogy in chapter 10, we're going to see that Sodom and Gomorrah come from Canaan's line. So that kind of fits along with that homosexual act there. We see where Sodom and Gomorrah later would be destroyed because of those similar acts. And so you see this cursing here, and it's a severe cursing. But again, like I said, that's a little bit kind of vague in some of the things. It doesn't spell out those things specifically. But the idea here is that there's going to be a vast difference between Ham's line and later Shem's line, which Shem's line is where we get Abraham, the people, and then we are going to see from Ham's line, that's where we get the Canaanites, who are going to be a constant thorn in the side of the Israelites, and there's going to be this battle that goes on between them all the time, and everything like that. So you see that at the end of chapter 9. All right, so that moves us to the story of the Tower of Babel, which we're going to recap now, chapters 10 and 11. In chapter 10, like I said, we have the genealogy of Ham, which produces, tells us that's where the Canaanites come from. That's where the Amorites come from. Sodom and Gomorrah come from. And so you have this line of Ham, because Canaan is cursed. You have all sorts of just ungodliness in the line of Ham that comes out of there. One of the other side notes from the story in the line of Canaan, one of those, I guess you could say, one of the blemishes in the life of the church, the history of the church, is basically in the 1900s, what you see them doing with the line of Canaan is they're saying that, hey, that line of Canaan is actually where the darker skinned people come from. And you see people like the Mormons, Jehovah's Witness, and the Pentecostals who come out and say that that's the cursed line of Canaan. That's the black people, and they're cursed. That's why they're black and all that kind of stuff. That's ungodly. That's not in the Bible. That's not true. But that was something that was made popular with the KKK in our nation's history in the, like I said, in the 1900s. Specifically, you have this idea that Canaan was the cursed line. That's where the black people came from. That's why they're cursed. Like I said, Mormons, Jehovah's went far and said black people could never go to heaven because they're cursed. And you had, like I said, you had the Oneness Pentecostals jump on that bandwagon pretty hard. William Branham was a big guy that pushed that in the 1940s and 50s, and they kind of latched on to that. But that's unbiblical. That has nothing to do with this passage. Nothing in this passage ever suggests that black people are cursed and white people aren't. Nowhere in there. That's just a made-up thing for people to push their racism. So that's the side note. So moving on to the Tower of Babel, we see that in chapter 11. In verses 1 through 9, we see the Tower of Babel. Now, the Tower of Babel is very interesting because God confuses the language there. We know that because they were disobedient. They didn't go out and populate the earth like God told them to. They kind of all stay in one place, and they build this tower. And what's really interesting is after God confuses their language and forces them to spread out, before we get into more of the tower thing, there's two stories that kind of show up all across the world. From different people groups and tribes, we see these commonalities that happen across every continent, except the continent of Antarctica. It's covered in ice. No one lives there. But the other 6 of the 7 continents, the other 6 continents, you see a couple things happening. Before internet and all this kind of stuff, you see these commonalities across there. 2 things that kind of connect all these different people groups across the continents is a flood story and pyramids, towers. It's really neat, isn't it? And I think Peleg explains this in chapter 10, verse 25. In chapter 10, verse 25, it says, Eber had 2 sons. One was named Peleg, for during his days the earth was divided. Now, if you remember back in Genesis chapter 1, on the 3rd day of creation, God gathered up all the dry land and all the water into one spot. So you had this supercontinent, like one continent of the land. And the science is finally catching up with the Bible, saying, oh yeah, there used to be one continent called Pangea. Well, the Bible has always taught that there was one continent, but then in the days of Peleg, it split apart. Now, Peleg, because we get in chapter 10, we get the genealogy of Ham, it's not that all these people and all these things happened before the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel happens during this time, but he just kind of gives the whole genealogy of Ham in chapter 10. And so chapter 11, the beginning of chapter 11 is a little bit out of order chronologically. And so the Tower of Babel happens, then Peleg happens, and it splits apart the earth. And so the earth splits apart, and you carry these stories of the flood, and then you see these pyramids pop up all across. You realize there's pyramids, not just in Egypt, but in every continent. There is these pyramids, ancient pyramids that pop up. It's pretty neat, pretty cool how that connects the whole of the population and across the world. Flood stories and pyramids. Pretty interesting. But back to what happens here with the Tower of Babel. What happens here at the Tower of Babel is you see the people, God said, multiply and fill the earth, and the people didn't. They said, well, let's build a city and we'll all gather up together. And so they build the city and they build this tower to reach to the heavens. And so God comes down and he confuses their language and sends them out to force them to spread out into these groups. And so now you have a problem. You have a language barrier problem. And that problem shows up in worship. We see later in the tabernacle and the temple, all the worship that happened, those happened in the Hebrew language. Which means if you didn't speak Hebrew or understand Hebrew, you were a non-participant in the worship service. You didn't know what was going on or what was being said. There was a language barrier there that you couldn't cross in order to worship the Lord and be a part of that worship. And so there's a language barrier because of the Tower of Babel. Well, Jesus fixes the language barrier. And we see that in the book of Acts. You see that in chapter 2 and verse 5 through 13 at Pentecost. We see that God fixes the language barrier. So I want us to flip over to that and just read just a short passage there from Acts chapter 2. It says, beginning in verse 5, it says, now there were Jews staying in Jerusalem, devout people from every nation under heaven. When this sound occurred, a crowd came together and was confused because each one heard them speaking in their own language. Pentecost has happened. The promise of the Holy Spirit has now been sent to the people of God, and they go out and they begin proclaiming the glories of God. And all these people, it says, people from every nation are represented. Just like at the Tower of Babel, every nation was represented, and then God confused their language and sent them out. And the language now divided them and separated them from the worship of God. But here, Jesus, because of Jesus and what he did on the cross, we see that the people are now from all the world are gathered back together in one spot, and that language barrier in worshiping God is removed. It says they all heard about the glorious works of God in their own language. If you skip down to verse 9, it says what languages were there here? And there was Parthians, there was Medes, there was Elamites, Mesopotamia, Judea, Pontus, Egypt, all these things, Libya, Cyrene, Cretans, all these people, Arabs. In verse 11, we hear them declaring the magnificent acts of God in our own language. Jesus removed the language barrier. So what we're seeing in Genesis, first we see that Jesus fulfilled the prophecy in Genesis 3:15 when sin entered the world and there's this sin problem. Now sin has separated man from God, and God makes this promise, this prophecy that there'll be enmity between the woman's seed and the serpent's seed, and he will, crush your head, he'll strike his heel, and that was a prophecy of Jesus. So Jesus would come and solve the sin problem. We also see in the ark, in the flood narrative, how the ark was the only way of salvation for Noah and his family, just like that was pointing us to Jesus. And Jesus is the only way of salvation for us today. And now we see that Jesus solves the language problem. And because of Jesus, we can all come before the throne of God and worship him. Language is no longer a barrier. So all these problems that man is creating in the book of Genesis, problem after problem, sin, rebellion, all these things that man is creating in our sinfulness, Jesus overcomes. Jesus overcomes all of our sins and all of our problems. All the barriers that we continuously put between us and God, Jesus tears them down. And again, we're seeing that again with the Tower of Babel. A problem comes, man is cursed, languages are now a barrier. Jesus removes that barrier. Any barrier that sin puts in your life between you and God, Jesus can overcome and remove that barrier. But only Jesus. And so I encourage you, as you read through here and we go through Genesis, continuously remind yourself and look for pictures of Jesus and how Jesus continuously overcomes our problems, our sinfulness, our brokenness, our cursings. Jesus overcomes those, but only Jesus. Hope you have a great day, and I look forward to our next video together.